The New York Knicks have their next head coach. They're expected to hire Mike Brown. We're going to talk about it right now on Locked On Knicks.
You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, what's up, guys? You are Locked On Knicks. My name is Gavin Schall. I'm the Saturday co-host of the Locked On NBA podcast. He is Alex Wolfe, editor-in-chief of The Strickland, the greatest Knicks website in the whole wide world. You can check them out on all forms of social media over at thestrict.land. This is Locked On Knicks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Your daily podcast on the New York Knicks, giving those detailed insight on your favorite team 5 whole days a week. So be sure to join thousands of other Knicks fans and subscribing on both YouTube and your favorite podcast platform for the best insight on your favorite team every single day, especially because they now have a new head coach. Mike Brown, according to Ian Begley and Chams Charania, is expected to be hired as the Knicks head coach in quick succession. We're going to give you our rapid reaction on that. What is the overlap with Tom Thibodeau? Is there a concerning amount of overlap with Tom Thibodeau in terms of strengths and weaknesses, and what exactly new Mike Brown will bring to the table versus Tibbs? What does this say about the front office? Can they hire some top assistants? And what are our expectations year one? So we're going to get into all that in just a sec. But first, I want to remind everyone that today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. Alex Wolfe, let's just start with a temperature check. What is your gut feeling about the New York Knicks hiring Mike Brown?
I mean, I've been kind of like accepting of this for the last few days. This kind of seemed like the direction they were going to ultimately go. I look, if you asked me and I wasn't the one interviewing the coaches, I was probably more of a Taylor Jenkins guy, but ultimately, like, I think Brown's resume is good. I think that he did really well for himself in Sacramento. There are some questions, obviously, like some of the things that Sacramento fans were unhappy with him about are the same things that Knicks fans were unhappy with Tibbs about, in terms of like burying younger players that the fan base generally thought like has been good and the numbers supported them, like Keon Ellis. I know Kings fans weren't super happy with that, but ultimately, I mean, with the hand he was dealt, he created a pretty good defense there. They ran, I think, more creative offense than what the Knicks ran. He certainly did a really good job of utilizing a versatile big man in Sabonis on offense, which he'll get, barring any trades or anything happening, he'll get Karl Anthony Towns, who's a versatile offensive big man to work with on the Knicks. So that's a plus. Sort of a similar situation, like star player wise, although they have different skill sets, obviously, but he's coming from a team with a star point guard, star center with some defensive issues, to a team with a star point guard, star center, both with some defensive issues of their own, but a really good defensive team otherwise, in terms of like the personnel that he's handed with all the wings that the Knicks have and everything else. So, I feel pretty good about it. I mean, I think that he's, some people might look at it and be like, well, how is this any better than having Tibbs, considering he's also like kind of a retread, kind of an older coach, whatever, older sensibilities, been a head coach since, on and off since the mid 2000s. So it's like, has he learned enough about the modern game and whatever? I would say that based off what he was able to do with Sacramento, I think that speaks pretty well for him. But the question will be, is he a next level coach, or is he just a culture setter, kind of like what Tibbs was? You got to hope it's the next level coach, because that's what the Knicks are hiring for. But that's just kind of my thoughts. I mean, I'm willing to give them benefit of the doubt. They interviewed him. They were very thorough with, I think, this interview process. And, we'll talk about it a little later in the show, but a lot of this, I think, is going to come down to, are they going to handpick a bench for him, like handpick his assistant coaches, his top assistants, to, help things along and bring some really smart minds in here. So it's kind of more of a group think than just like installing Mike Brown and being like, figure it out yourself. I think that'll be key. But as of right now, my inclination is I feel all right with it. I don't know. How are you feeling about it?
Now, I'm in a very similar place. I think cautiously optimistic would be the right way to describe it. The Keon Ellis point, and you noted this the last episode we did, the over reliance on their starting lineup at the beginning of the year there are just so many echoes of what the Knicks went through this year, right? They have De'Aaron Fox, obviously he's going to be out there. They have DeMar DeRozan. They just paid Malik Monk like big money on extension. Obviously, Domantas Sabonis was going to be out there. Keegan Murray was their top 5 pick from 3 years ago. And on paper, those were your 5 best and your 5 most important players. So you were going to play them together, and yet the numbers screamed they were not very good with those 5 guys on the court. And they were really good when you plugged in Keon Ellis, specifically because he didn't need the basketball, because he had off-ball gravity, because he was a playmaker defensively. And I look back at all that, and I go to Deuce McBride, and the parallels just kind of scream in my mind of like, I'll steal Benji Ritholtz's term when he was talking about this, like an analytics darling who was like kind of unfairly benched because he wasn't the bigger name. And I wonder if Mike Brown learned from that. My real question here is like, was that actually the concern of the Knicks front office when they fired Tom Thibodeau? Was it, hey, like we have all this lineup data that screamed we're really good with 5 shooters out on the floor, and that's how we maximize Karl Anthony Towns, this piece we gave up everything to get? Or did the Knicks front office mostly agree with how Tom Thibodeau deployed talent, and it was just that Mikal Bridges and OG Anunoby were coming to them and saying, hey, we don't really want to play for this dude anymore? And Karl Anthony Towns was saying, I despised how I was used, in which case there's a world where Mike Brown is Tom Thibodeau with a fresh coat of paint. I don't really think that, though, because he, to your point, was just a lot more set-based than Tom Thibodeau was. And this is something that Shaq's highlighted in the really good breakdown he wrote of Mike Brown, where he was very happy to orient the offense around their talent. And if they had movement shooters, it was, all right, let's run action for them off the ball, which is not something Tom Thibodeau consistently did for Dante DiVincenzo or for Quentin Grimes or now for Deuce McBride. And I do think there's going to be more of a focus on, here's what I have offensively and defensively. How can I adjust it? There's like another point that Benji made. Like he used Domantas Sabonis at the level, and he used him aggressively, acknowledging like, hey, this guy is a fantastic 5 offensively. I have to do some weird creative things to maximize him defensively. I do think there is a stubbornness with Mike Brown, but I think his baseline inclinations are a little bit better than Tom Thibodeau's. And that's really encouraging to me, beyond the fact that he's clearly a guy they were comfortable with from a media point of view, from a expectations point of view, from a pressure point of view, a guy who's won multiple I think 3 or 4 championships in his NBA career, someone who's been coach of the year before, like has been in those stages, has felt that pressure and has handled it pretty well. I think to your point on Taylor Jenkins, I tend to agree with you. I don't know if that was as much of a priority for me, but I also haven't been in that situation. I haven't been in those press conferences. So maybe I'm underestimating it. And maybe that is a key thing in Mike Brown's favor. That was something that Tom Thibodeau was very good at, both to your point as a culture setter and someone who could, I guess, just handle like the context he was in New York. And they felt like some of the younger coaches they interviewed weren't quite ready for that stage.
Yeah, maybe on that point too. I mean, considering his age and coaching age, I guess I should say, like his actual age doesn't really matter, but the amount of time that he spent on NBA teams, the fact that he kind of had to like go through the process of the sort of humbling of being, a head coach, getting ousted in Cleveland, and then coming back as an assistant with the Warriors, working in that capacity for a while, then, goes to the Lakers. That was short-lived. Just didn't seem like a great fit ultimately, but then, ending up with the Kings and kind of growing as a coach there. Seems like he's been in a variety of different locker rooms. And I think we saw pretty quickly when the exit interviews happened, and then like a day later, Tibbs got fired, that there was clearly a little more going on in the locker room than we thought this year. And maybe some guys that were unhappy with Tibbs's ability to communicate things effectively, to the point where certain guys started kind of saying stuff to the media that was enough to raise our eyebrows, at least. So maybe that's a part of it too. I mean, I do think that there's something to be said for like a lot of NBA coaching is managing personalities and, ensuring that people all feel like they're valued on the court and that they're all being utilized right and utilized in the ways that they want. And so from that perspective, I kind of get this hire too. Like he is someone who's been around the block a number of times. He's been on some really high profile championship teams, like when he was an assistant with the Warriors. So, I think there's something to that as well. And that was probably something that they brought up, being like, hey, these were some of the things that Mikal Bridges said to us, that OG Anunoby said to us, that Karl Anthony Towns said to us, and maybe even Josh Hart, for all we know. I doubt Brunson said anything because he seems so even keel. But, these are things that guys were saying to us in exit interviews. Like, this is how our players want to be utilized, that we're going to be riding with this year. Like, we would like to win a championship with them, and it's going to take them all being on the same page. Do you think you can handle that part of the job? And I get the feeling that was probably, for a front office that is so relationships based, with Leon and Worldwide West and all that, that was probably a pretty big point of the interview process, and that probably won Brown some favor with the Knicks front office. So I think that's probably something we should sort of keep an eye on, and might be something that, whenever he does his intro press conference or MSG network interview or whatever ends up happening to introduce Mike Brown as coach, that'll be something I'll definitely be listening for in terms of how he hopes to manage the personalities and kind of lead this team in that way going forward.
Yeah, and I think, look, I kind of phrased it and maybe quickly dismissed it as like that shouldn't be the sole reason to hire a head coach. It should be a priority. Like you built an infrastructure and a culture in which Jalen Brunson was willing to take 70% of what he's worth to give this team flexibility to go and win a championship. And it is something we talked about in light of Tom Thibodeau being fired, that there was a lot of good done under Tom Thibodeau. Like I think player development was probably the greatest one of those. I'd have to go back and look at Mike Brown's track record to get a gauge of that. He's mostly coached very veteran laden teams. So that's something to watch, with 4 rookies coming back from last year, some of which we think could potentially break into the rotation. I mean, on paper, none of those guys are going to play right away, but with injuries and stuff, you don't know. And you hope that continues. But in terms of just having everyone move the right direction, I do think that will be a strength of Mike Brown. And I know when we had Matt George, again, the host of Locked On Kings, on, that was something he really emphasized, in the fact that like De'Aaron Fox, despite like rumors to the contrary, had a level of loyalty that when Mike Brown was fired, he essentially said like, all right, I'm done. Like, I don't want to be here anymore. You guys aren't serious about winning. And he took a Sacramento team that was in a very similar place as the Knicks were when Tom Thibodeau came in, and led them to their best season in 16 years. Like that's not nothing. And it is a credit to him from an X's and O's perspective, but it is also a credit that like some of those same strengths that Tom Thibodeau had, he will maintain. And if you brought in a coach that hit marks from, again, like an X's and O's standpoint and a lineup optimization standpoint, and was like interested and willing to engage with the NBA's largest analytics department, those are all great. But if you lose what Tom Thibodeau did exceptionally well, it might not have ultimately mattered. So I do think all that stuff is significant and exciting. When we come back, let's get into some of the importance of what kind of assistants he hires, what this says about the style of play the team will have next year, and what the front office continues to prioritize. And then we'll finish up with some expectations heading into year one. We'll get into all that in just a sec here on Locked On Knicks.
But first, we want to let you know about our friends over at Monarch Money. Do you ever wish managing your money felt easier with Monarch Money? It can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. And, one thing with Monarch Money that's pretty cool is that it tells you all of the various expenditures that you're having. Sometimes there are subscriptions that you've forgotten about that then just start auto billing. It's like, oh, you try it because like, oh, sweet, a month free trial. And then they make you put that credit card information in. Suddenly you're getting charged for it and you don't even realize it because there's so many subscriptions now. It's like everybody's got 15 of them. And it's easy to lose track. So Monarch Money is great for that, putting it all itemized in a nice, easy to follow format so that you can make sure that you're not spending on anything you don't want to be spending on. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for half off your first year. All right, we're back in to keep talking through Mike Brown as the new head coach of the New York Knicks. And Gavin, this is what I'm really excited to hear the news on, is what his assistant coaches are going to look like. This was something that I brought up when we were talking the other day about him potentially getting hired, that I think is going to be important. And we're already starting to see some things come out, as the steam was starting to build over the last couple of days towards Mike Brown being head coach. All of a sudden, we're starting to see reports about some of the guys that might become assistant coaches under him. One of which is James Borrego, who we determined the other day, like when we were talking about his interview for the head coaching position, like in our opinion, I think a pretty good stint with the Charlotte Hornets, and managed to take a team that has not done much since and get them above 500 and compete for a play-in spot and everything else. And like what ultimately just ended up being a really deep year in the East that year that made it difficult for them to make it into the playoffs. But ultimately, like, I think he's good. He seems like a good offensive coach, a good offensive mind, which I think will be good to pair with Mike Brown, who has some really good defensive chops. But it's seeming like, and there's nothing official out yet, that James Borrego will probably be brought in to be his lead assistant, which leads me to believe that the Knicks are probably doing something similar to what they did when they hired Tibbs, which is handpicking the lead assistants on his bench. And that was probably part of the process of selecting the coach too, which again, we weren't sitting in on the interviews. Maybe Taylor Jenkins was more opposed to that. Maybe Mike Brown was like, sure, do whatever you want. Like hire guys behind me. That's fine. But we do know that that's what they did with Tibbs when they first hired him. They brought Mike Woodson in, former head coach. They brought Johnny Bryan in, who was a really promising assistant coach. They brought Kenny Payne in, really respected college assistant that, 2 out of those 3 guys wound up getting head coaching positions within 2 years at the college level of coming in with the Knicks. So, I think that's what they're trying to do again. That is perhaps what gives me the most hope here, because I do think when you look at what a lot of the most successful teams in the league have done with their coaching staff in the last number of years, the teams that ultimately end up making it pretty far in the playoffs, potentially winning championships, whatever, usually it's a head coach. And then you look on the bench and you see, oh, there are a bunch of faces I recognize there. Like there are like former head coaches on this bench. Like you have multiple strong voices in the locker room, multiple strong voices at team meetings, which I think, again, not being in the rooms myself, but from any other work environment, when you have multiple people that are willing to respect and collaborate with each other, you come up with the best ideas, you come up with the best schemes, and you're more likely to, be willing to be swayed on certain changes or whatever. And that's sort of the things where I think the Tibbs experience hit its low point when Tibbs ultimately was just left to his own devices with his handpicked assistants down the stretch of his time with the Knicks after all 3 of those handpicked assistants had left. But the Knicks now, like, going for it this year, like bringing in a whole new coaching staff that will at least be there this year when they have a real chance at potentially winning a championship. I think that's going to be a winning move. James Borrego seems like a great start, but I'm really intrigued to see what the rest of his bench is going to look like.
Yeah, I believe I was just looking. I wasn't able to 100% confirm this, but I think it was reported that James Borrego is still under contract with New Orleans, and I think they would have to let him out of that. I wonder if the Knicks could throw them some kind of asset to make that happen, because I'm with you that he would potentially be a game changer for Mike Brown, because the Knicks, once again, and this is, I may be reiterating some of what I said first segment, but they went out and they go get Karl-Anthony Towns last season, right? And when you get Karl-Anthony Towns, my presumption was, all right, we're leaning into offense, right? And then you, with limited flexibility this offseason, you add Jordan Clarkson and you add Gershon Yabusele. And again, I come out of that thinking like, all right, we're leaning into offense, but there's also been some notion to the idea of like, maybe the front office wants to see Cat at the 4 a little bit more. Maybe they think he can be more successful there. And they were going to try to hire Mike Inori, who, like, again, maybe that was just because the Wolves front office traded for Rudy Gobert, but that was a coach who was very comfortable playing Cat at the 4. So I would love to know what Mike Brown's take on that is. We probably won't know it for sure until preseason game 1 and we see what that initial starting lineup is. I think I've made it pretty clear, Alex. My belief is that the best path forward would be to start Deuce, would be to play 5 out. And I think Yabusele in particular could be like a very interesting flex piece in that. And someone like, gives you a second guy along with OG Anunoby that has legitimate power forward size that brings like plus shooting to the table, maybe even better than Anunoby, or at the very least similar to Anunoby, and is just like a quick decision maker who can actually leverage like when you have 5-out offense, like that is great on paper, right? It opens a lot up at a baseline. If you genuinely have 5 shooters and 2 of them are stars out there, your offense is going to be good. I think the difference between it being good and special is like how quick are the other 3 guys to, 1, shoot the basketball when open, 2, attack a closeout and make the next pass. I think that has been the brilliance of the Boston Celtics over the last few years. And I think in Yabusele, and maybe to a slightly lesser extent, but to some extent in Clarkson, they have 2 guys who can do that. And I'm hoping the coach leans into that. To that point, I just saw this tweet from our buddy Chris Persianen where he said, have also heard the extent to which Mike Brown was quote unquote bought in on Brunson and Towns as a duo was notable to the Knicks throughout the interview process. Doesn't mean the Knicks are married to the pairing. Things change fast, but making the most of what you have may be a factor. To me, that screams Cat at the 5 because we saw in the playoffs, and this is what I didn't like. As much as I was excited about Mitchell Robinson being on the floor, what I didn't like about it is Cat was an afterthought. And there was almost, to me, like no point of even playing him when he was at the 4, Alex, because there was no designed offense for him. There was no ability for him to go and get threes. The lane was clogged, so you couldn't just throw him the ball and say, hey, like put your head down and burrow downhill the way he was able to do at the 5. And you could go either way on that and say, like, 1, Mike Brown will recognize that that's a problem and say, all right, we need to lean into 5 out. Or 2, he, unlike Tom Thibodeau, is creative enough that when Cat is out there at the 4, he can pull from some of what Minnesota did and say, hey, we can run big to big action, or we can run off ball screens for Cat to get him open threes and still have him be heavily involved, even when he's playing power forward, because you still want to, you're still at a deficit with him out there defensively. You need to leverage his offensive ability if you're going to go big. That tweet to me indicates that that is like a very essential part of the thought process. And honestly, as much as I hated all the do stuff and it's interwoven in this, I think Tibbs is probably his biggest sin last year was at times of failure to recognize what kind of talent he had offensively in Karl-Anthony Towns, and that if you're going to live with this terrible defense, the offense needs to be maximized to the nth degree if you're going to have a championship team with him playing a big role.
Yeah, pretty much. And I think that another thing that Brown should hopefully bring to the table in terms of offense would be transition scoring, which I just looked up, in the year 2 years ago, 22 to 23 season, the Kings had the best offense in basketball per offensive rating per NBA stats. It was over 120, which is crazy. But they also were 3rd in the NBA in transition points with 25.1 per game, behind only the Pacers and Grizzlies that year. I think that's another thing that we saw the Knicks like start last year executing and then taper off as the year went on. And that was always sort of the Tibbs experience, was doing things that made sense at the beginning of the year and then slowly but surely devolving back into just essentially running isolation sets by the end of the year. And it was like he would come out and be like, look at all these new things we did, or look at these new focuses, look at these buzzwords. We're doing transition, we're doing 5 out, we're kicking to the corners, we're doing whatever. And then as the year went on, it'd be like, okay, Jalen, go out there and win the game. And that was kind of just the Tibbs offense. So my hope would be, given that we've seen that Mike Brown, coached an offense in Sacramento that, managed to be one of the top transition offenses for an entire season. I think this Knicks team wants to get out and run. It's always in many ways felt like you've got certain guys on the team in Bridges, Anunoby, even Josh Hart, especially, that you can tell are raring to go all the time and get out in transition. And it almost felt like if they're the horse, like Tibbs was pulling the reins back, being like, nope, like give it to Jalen, walk it down the floor, just get into a half court set. Like that's what we want to do. We want to burn clock, and we saw that bite the Knicks in so many games this year, especially in the second half, where they would have a lead from running in transition early in the game. And then for the whole last quarter or so, be like, okay, let's slow it down. We're going to just burn clock now. Like we're a football team running out the clock here. So I hope that's something that we see more of. That would also be something with getting a Borrego if they're able to do that. I was going to say, I forget where I saw the tweet, but it was that it was, I think, from one of the beat guys that was basically saying that Borrego is under contract, but there was a belief that he would possibly be able to take the Knicks job, even if it's a lateral move. So we'll see how that goes. But if he is able to come to the Knicks, that's another guy that's very transition oriented. And I feel like that's probably something, especially considering the team that ultimately ousted the Knicks in the playoffs this year, being the Pacers, one of the best transition teams in basketball the last couple of years. That probably had something to do with it. Probably had something to do with their hire and and a potential priority there. But we'll continue talking through this, also including talking about some expectations for year one for Mike Brown in just a second when we get back in to Locked On Knicks here. All right, Gavin, it's the ultimate question is expectations. I think, to me, the expectation here is that the Knicks are making this hire thinking, and we're seeing, I mean, this is the thought process of the entire East right now. There's a clear power vacuum, right? The last two East champions, if I was a betting man, and sometimes I am, I would put money specifically on them not making it out of the East next year. Like the last two East champions, the Pacers and the Celtics, who probably would have been strong favorites at full health next year as well to potentially make it out of the East, both without their top players, you assume for the entire year. The Bucks, who knows what's happening there after the first day and a half of free agency with the amount of dead money on their books now, the fact that they're banking it all on Giannis and Miles Turner effectively to potentially win them a championship or keep them relevant, whatever. I don't know, but it seems clear that there's a vacuum in the East right now where someone can step in and become the team that ascends and makes it out of the East next year. Now, whether that's the Knicks, who obviously got within a couple games of doing it in this past playoffs, whether that's the Cavs, who had a very disappointing end to a really successful regular season, whether it's another team, whether like the Magic have done enough, or one of the other teams, the Hawks have been making tons of moves, thinking obviously that they think that they can step in next year and take a step forward. It's clear that there's a vacuum. And I think that for me, when it comes to expectations for Brown, it's pretty much championship. I mean, that's why they're making this hire. This is why they fired Tibbs, was right there in the press release was, we want to win a championship. We are committed to winning a championship in New York. And that's why we fired Tibbs. And that's why we're looking for another coach. So for me, it's harsh for Mike Brown. And I'm sure that he knows the pressure cooker he just stepped into. But effectively, this situation is championship or bust at this point to me. And I'm not saying that means that you fire him after 1 year or something. The Knicks will have, thanks to using their taxpayer mid-level this year, they're once again hard capped at the second apron, which means they're not going to be able to get into that second apron, which extends their window actually to keep this team together without dealing with those second apron penalties. So you've got a few years to try to take advantage of that window, but I think progress is going to have to be a thing. And I think, like, at minimum, you got to at least make the Eastern Conference Finals this year, but hopefully make a finals and take a step further than you did last year.
Yeah, so I think first, I just want to note real quick, circling back on the transition point, our guy Schwinn tweeted this out earlier. Gershon Yabusele, 1.49 points per possession in transition. So that's basically an effective field goal percentage of just under 75% from the field. He was 97th percentile in transition. So that is another guy who can get out and run and finish effectively, to your point. I think I disagree with you on this point. For me, it is obviously about results, but it is even more so about process. Like, I think the Knicks results exceeded their process last year. And in some ways they were tremendously lucky. And that's not to say they weren't good enough to make the conference finals or they weren't deserving to make the conference finals. I just think in the ways Tom Thibodeau limited them, they made the conference finals on incredibly small margins. Like we mentioned the stat before, but they had an exactly 0 net rating for the whole playoffs, despite winning 2 rounds and losing in 6 in the 3rd round, right? Which is kind of insane. They very easily could have lost to Detroit if a few shots don't go in that ultimately went in. Healthy Kristaps Porzingis, they definitely could have lost to the Boston Celtics. And they had enormous health luck on their side. Like guys like Karl Anthony Towns and OG Anunoby that are perennially injured, like were healthy for basically or more or less healthy. Obviously, Cat was battling through some stuff, but for every key stretch of the season last year, we won't necessarily get that this year. But if the process is better, if they play optimal lineups, if they show more scheme versatility defensively, I think that this hire could still be the right one, even in a world where they lose in the 2nd round. Now, to your point, in an Eastern Conference that is this wide open, like I agree, probably survive the year, but if they don't at least get to the conference finals, like on paper, they should beat every team other than the Cavs. And the Cavs, like, I think we're on the same page. Probably most Knicks fans are on the same page. Our buddy over at Locked On Cavs, Danny Cunningham, probably wouldn't agree with this, but there is a certain softness there that the Pacers took advantage of, that the Knicks in the past took advantage of. And despite the fact that I think Cleveland is tremendously talented and focused in terms of like the types of players that like give a lot of credit to Kobe Altman. I know this is a little off track, but the types of players they brought in with like the shooting, passing, defense, like they are constructed in a very clean way, in a way that the Knicks aren't maybe as perfectly constructed. That being said, I think the Knicks are completely capable of beating the Cavs. And as a Knicks fan, there isn't a team like the Boston Celtics that should just put the fear of God into you. To me, the question is like, do you have that Pacers-esque ability of one to go like 9-10 deep, which I think with the additions of Clarkson, with the additions of Yabusele, I think we're both believers that at least one of the rookies should be ready come playoff time to be a contributor. This team can play that deep. Two, can you put 5 guys on the floor at a time that can defend and then offensively pass, dribble, shoot? I think that's what's going to be a little bit tougher for the Knicks, and they have obvious roster constraints there. I think they can offset that with having the best offense in basketball. And I'm going to try to scroll up and find it. Someone posted a question, 221_B Baker. I've heard nothing about defense from this conversation. I wonder why. Went on to say, we're going to be a bottom 10 defense. I need to do a deeper dive on Mike Brown as a defensive coach. What I've heard, again, is like he's willing to be versatile. He's willing to adjust to the talent he has. In Golden State, he consistently led one of the top 2 or 3 defenses in basketball. Of course, they had fantastic personnel, and that helped, but he did have to, some extent, cover up for someone like a Steph Curry. So I think there's reasons to be encouraged on that end. And most importantly, Sacramento this past season, I would say with terrible defensive personnel at the time of his firing, unless I'm grossly mistaken and I'm misremembering things, they were a top 15 defense in the NBA. I actually think he did fantastic coaching on that end of the floor. But the reason I'm not fixating on this, and Alex, maybe we can end on this, is because I think this team is built to be an offensive juggernaut, and they are built to be the best offense in basketball. And if you can do that and you can play average defense, I think that is their pathway to a title. And they might not be better than the team they see out west, because a team like the Thunder is going to be probably top 3 or 4 on both ends of the floor. But as we've seen with injuries, with shooting variance, just with sheer star power, the Knicks did it this past year. You can beat a team that's better than you in a single series. And I think, to your point, expectations are high, because I don't think the Knicks walk into a series in the Eastern Conference where they're at a clear-cut talent disadvantage.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I agree with your point too, that like this team is built more for offense right now. I think that's not even debatable. Like especially if Cat is still the starting center. Mm-hmm. Now, I kind of think, based off what we saw during this past postseason, I think that starting Mitch and Cat together is really worth a look. And if you have a more versatile offensive coach out there that's able to find ways to make that work and utilize Cat more, find more catch and shoot opportunities for him, run more pick and pop with him, run more complicated actions where Cat can space the floor out and then leave Mitch as a lob threat. Like, I think there are ways to maximize that offense, the offense of that lineup, more than what we saw when they were very clearly just kind of going off instinct, playing together for their first real minutes during this past postseason, but some really impactful minutes. That said, if you're starting Cat at center, or even if you're not starting him there and you're just trying to play him a decent number of minutes there, you're gonna invariably, focus more on offense. Like, it's just, it makes more sense, because then you're gonna have all offensive personnel out there. And honestly, if you can have a team that has a offensive rating like what those Kings did a couple years ago of around 120,
best in NBA history at the time, we should know.
Exactly. I mean, if you could put up one of the best offensive ratings in NBA history, which again, we saw this team do for the first 2 months of last season before Tibbs sort of, again, pulled the reins back on the offense and said, no, stop running pick and pop and having fun and, doing the thing. Let's stop generating as many threes for Cat and, stop playing 5 out as much, whatever. We saw that, like, this team can be a super elite offense, and they have really elite talent that is pretty much everyone on the floor at any given time can be good at catch and shoot threes. Everyone on the floor, for the most part, can break down a defense in some way or another and can pass out of the post if they get in there. So if you get a more creative offensive mind in there and you can get up to that level where you're reaching like top 1 or 2 in the NBA in scoring, and then can just have, with the more offensively inclined lineup out there, keep it around, 15th in the league in net rating, but then know that when it counts late in games, you have a lineup that you can throw out there, which the Knicks still will, barring a trade. They will still have that defensive death lineup that they can throw out there late in a game if they just need a stop of Deuce McBride, Mikal Bridges, OG Anunoby, Josh Hart, presumably, and then Mitchell Robinson. Or now you can maybe even switch Yabu in there and have him be the 4 with Mitch at the 5. You could have a lineup you could throw out there that can stop pretty much anyone for a single possession. And that's all you need a lot of times in close games is you need the scoring talent to get you that bucket to go ahead. And then you need the defensive talent to be able to get a stop. As long as the Knicks are well prepared for that, then it doesn't matter to me if they're like a top 10 defense in the league during the regular season or whatever. Because it's all just about the margins. Like if your offense is that much better than everyone else, that you're still, even if your defensive rating isn't phenomenal, but you're still outscoring teams like 7 points per 100 possessions or whatever, who cares? Like that's great. That's good. They should strive for that sort of thing. I think that's probably what helped motivate this. But again, hopefully they fill out a really nice bench unit for Mike Brown, get some, smart minds in there. And much like we saw in, like, for example, Los Angeles this past year with like Jeff Van Gundy joining the Clippers and sort of reforming what they were able to do on defense and creating a really great defense around Kawhi Leonard and James Harden. Like maybe we now see the Knicks do something similar where they have a great offensive mind at head coach and then a really great defensive assistant that can at least have them prepared for various different scenarios, even with suboptimal defensive pieces out there. So we'll see, but that's kind of my general thought. I mean, of course, we'll see what the bench starts shaping up to look like, but for now, I'm feeling pretty good about it. And I'm kind of with you where like offense can and should be the top thing that you have here.
Yeah.
With the personnel on the team, because it's not a team that's built to just be a defensive juggernaut that gets by on the margins. They're a team that's meant to blow you out of the water and do enough on defense to keep the lead, basically.
Yeah, and I think they're totally capable of that. I think Mike Brown is capable of coaching that type of team. A lot more to come. We have a full summer to talk about it, but until then, he's Alex. I'm Gavin. We'll hit you soon on Locked On Knicks.